So I think the first thing to discuss as it relates to spinning out is what does it actually mean to spin out? So in my mind, a spin out is when you're actually physically taking the company and setting it up outside of the university environment. There's many reasons why it makes sense to spin a company out of the university, but there's also many reasons to keep that company operating within the confines of the university environment. So for example, you may lose use of expensive equipment and resources. It gets harder to access research grants, and non-dilutive funding can sometimes become more challenging. And you shouldn't avoid or overlook the fact that you'll have to take on increased human resource and legal burden. That being said, assuming these reasons are no longer important or relevant, and there's a need to accelerate the development of the company, then it likely does make sense to spin the company out of the university. So an example would be when the company itself needs to take on meaningful external capital to build staffing and resources, and it has the wherewithal and the capital necessary to exist and survive outside of the university environment. And it is in the company's best interest to do so. So formally, spinning out a company from the University of Calgary would mean setting up an operation that has the staffing, resources, physical space to conduct and operate the spin-out company's business and purpose. The company may still have connections back to the university through research services agreements or other types of agreements, but for all intents and purposes, a spin-out means operating the company outside of the university and moving it from a virtual or incubated entity inside the university to an external and standalone operation. So in my opinion, the right time to spin out an entity is therefore the moment at which the capital and or growth needs of the company necessitate the creation of a standalone operations with the goal of creating a company outside of the university walls. It's really important to understand that the development of a technology-based company is tied very deeply to the achievement of technical and sometimes business milestones that represent the reduction of risk associated with the company's business opportunity. This is somewhat self-evident, but to give you an example, if you have already built a product, taken it to market, sold it to customers, then we understand some fundamental things about that business, like what the customer's price they will pay. We understand what it costs to develop that product. And therefore, we've meaningfully reduced some questions and risks that are not self-evident from the moment of discovery. So with this in mind, it is critical that you understand not only what the next meaningful milestones are, but also how meaningful these milestones are from the perspective of the investor. And it's important to note that the milestones an investor sees may be different from what you as a researcher might think are important from a technological perspective. Therefore, it's important to align technical or business milestones with what an investor would deem to be meaningful risk reduction that is financeable, because we don't go from discovery to market overnight. We go through a series of financeable and understandable milestones that we can raise capital to achieve on. So it is critical to understand what milestones are important to your roadmap and what it will cost to achieve these milestones. Now, there's always a healthy tension between what those milestone achievements should be and what capital it will take to get there. And it's an important consideration as it relates to when to spin out and when not to. This is particularly relevant as it relates to the cost of staffing, cost of overheads, cost of access to equipment, particularly when that equipment may be specialized. A great example of this is if your business requires wet lab space with the appropriate equipment, resources, and staff necessary to conduct the early stage studies to determine whether or not there is sufficient information to raise capital and potentially spin the company out of the university. In these situations, you often need specialized people, specialized resources, and specialized equipment only found within the lab environment itself, which is very expensive to set up outside of the university environment and requires meaningful funding to do so. This is an example of a situation where being particularly thoughtful about when and where to spin out of the business is very important. So one of the most important considerations in road mapping is, do you have the capacity to raise private capital to support the development of your intellectual property? Inherent in the idea of spinning out is the idea that you are able to fund core aspects of the operation that would be necessary to sustain and grow the business. In the context of a technology company, intellectual property protection is a critical piece. It is a good activity to conduct while within the walls of the university, but once you spin out, it can often be critical. There's a significant and important need to maintain the execution of that intellectual property, which can become quite expensive, particularly when you hit things like national phase. So from the moment you file intellectual property, think about a clock that starts to tick, and within 12 to 24 months, you are going to require additional capital to further the execution of that intellectual property and the business. This is particularly relevant if you're going to multi-jurisdictions, Canada, US, China, etc. And in particular, in life science-based companies and technology businesses, the scope and strength of that company's intellectual property filing is actually going to be a really important indicator of future fundraising success. Beyond IP funding, there are a number of other considerations that are critical in terms of ensuring appropriate levels of cash flow. We often use the term, how long is your current runway, or runway, to express the amount of capital that you have on hand. Relative to the amount of cash you are burning, runway describes how many months of spending do you have before you run out of cash. When you divide up the cash on hand by the spend you are making on a monthly basis, this is what we mean by runway. It is important and arguably critical to understand when you spin out a company, how much capital you have on hand relative to the activities you are undertaking to achieve your next technical and business milestone. Typically, 6 months is sort of the minimum level of cash on hand necessary to raise the next round of capital, i.e. you need 6 months of runway in order to execute on that fundraising milestone. So when you determine whether or not you want to spin out of a university, you've really got to ask yourself, what is it going to cost you to operate on a month-to-month basis, and how many months of capital do I have on hand to do that? While you are in the university, you need to think hard about, can I raise capital? What do I need to raise capital on in order to spin the entity out of the university? And not only have sufficient capital to take on those expenses, but to have sufficient runway to be able to execute the next important milestone, which will then allow you to raise your next round of capital. So in short, when we think about spinning out, it's really important that you think deeply about the business plan. How much capital is it going to take? And what are the meaningful next technical and/or business milestones that will be necessary in order to raise the next tranche of capital? So if you think about it that way, building a business plan and business planning prior to spin out is quite an important activity. It's important to recognize that when inside the walls of the university and not officially spun out, a researcher may have access to different grants and funding options which may or may not be accessible once outside the walls of the university. One of the most important criteria for determining whether or not technologies may or may not be accessible from a granting perspective includes who owns intellectual property. Has it been assigned to the company? These are important aspects to understand when considering grant funding going forward. Before you spin out, it's important to understand these things, and that in particular, the terms and conditions associated with the critical grants you may be using both currently and into the future in order to determine if the timing is right to spin out of the research environment. Therefore, it is important to understand that grant conditions can vary from funding organization to funding organization, and understanding the details of these things are really important as part of your spin-out consideration. So let's talk TRL level. TRL level is a tool that was created by NASA. It's best suited for deep tech type companies, and it is useful in trying to understand what level of technology development you are at as it relates to being commercially available. TRL is best used when dealing with deep tech companies that we would kind of align with kind of NASA's thinking of what deep tech is. That being said, investors, tech transfer offices, the average person can often understand TRL better than they can things like prototype, early stage, et cetera, et cetera. The problem with TRL is that depending on the industry you're in, whether it be therapeutic, medical devices, digital health, the level of TRL that you are in is likely to change from a commercial perspective. So what does that mean? It means that, for example, a digital health company might be at a seed stage of financing, which would be a phase where we might see venture capital, when they achieve TRL level 8 or 9 or higher, versus a seed stage financing for, say, a therapeutic company, which might only be TRL level 4 or 5. So this is a fundamental challenge with TRL. It's that we need to understand and adjust for the type of industry we are in order to apply TRL effectively. There are numerous resources online that can help you understand TRL development, which can help with how to both frame your idea and what TRL considerations might apply. For the purpose of this discussion, I'm going to use the example of intellectual property because it's pretty consistent across multiple industries. So let's talk early TRL 1 to 3. So this is kind of the area where we would cover sort of concepts, early research, where we're identifying and filing early patents based on algorithms, biomarkers, devices, or therapeutic mechanisms. It's a pretty critical phase, and universities typically own or have a portion of this intellectual property, so the TTO, or Technology Transfer Office, engagement is pretty essential to clarify inventorship and licensing. Early stage IP underpins future commercial value despite high technical and clinical risks. What does that mean? It means that the intellectual property is a way of sort of monetizing the future value of these technologies. So it's a pretty important phase and something we need to get right. TRL level 4 to 6, or sort of the middle phase of TRL levels, is typically the phase we associate with spinouts. We are often talking about prototypes, mechanisms of actions that are supported and strengthened by the patents that were filed in the earlier stage. Often they support method of use, systems of claims, and often we have a pretty good idea if there's a freedom to operate based on the initial intellectual property filings. At this stage, it's also pretty important to have licensing arrangements or assignment arrangements already in place with the company that is spinning out of the organization. As we get a little bit later on, TRL level 5 and 6, it is often ideal for spinouts to have a balance between sort of lower technical risk and defensible IP. So what do we mean by that? What we mean is that the technology that we're building is clearly defended by the intellectual property that was filed in the early and middle late stages. So as we move into the later stage of TRL, let's say TRL 7, 8, we're really focused on managing intellectual property as a commercial asset. So this is a situation where the spin-out has exclusive rights, it's taking care of ongoing filings, and in general, the IP is aligned with things like regulatory approvals, market entry, and there may even be trade secrets and competitive monitoring happening, which means that we're actually monitoring what our competitors are doing and thinking about how we can use our intellectual property to ensure that we have a sustainable competitive advantage. Universities are rarely involved at this stage, so the early spin-out process with the TTO really ensures protection of intellectual property, expansion of the claims, and moving it to the phase where the company can then take it at the late stage and effectively support commercialization and scaling as the technology matures. One of the things we think about as an investor is, do you have the right team for the right phase of development? So, can you reach your next technical milestone as a solo founder? Do you need to bring in a CEO or a chief operating officer to support the business or technical fundamentals? Early technical milestones are often achievable by a solo founder or a scientific founder. So we would consider early first pre-seed, second pre-seed rounds of investments as the type of investment round where we don't necessarily always have to have a full team. But as you progress forward, having a CEO at the table may be an important consideration for future raises. Small capital rounds are much easier to achieve as a solo founder. So generally speaking, if the technology is coming from a research space, an early first technical milestone that does not require meaningful capital to achieve or does not have any major business milestones may not require a CEO. Where it does become important is in subsequent financing rounds, which takes larger amounts of capital and larger amounts of time in order to achieve the business and commercial milestones. When this occurs, other considerations apply. For example, much of the company's ability to raise capital depends on what we call a balanced management team. It is typically a stronger company on average from an investor's perspective if the company has both strong technical and business acumen. There are exceptions, but on average, it's generally acceptable that having both of these capabilities is important. So raising capital, as mentioned, is pretty important. So not having the business acumen and or experience to raise capital may be a limiting factor. Exceptions exist. For example, in companies in the therapeutic space that go through long research and development timelines, the early stages of de-risking may not require the business expertise, but it's always wise to have business advisors at the table because it signals to the investor that you're thinking about more than just technical aspects of your business. Conversely, as an example, a digital health company that moves very quickly through the early TRL stages may depend on demonstrating that they have a customer and a market in order to secure that first round of financing. As soon as we talk about selling to customers, it's generally viewed as a positive to have business resources at the table who can execute not only in the business, but also have the network and connections in the community in which you are trying to sell. So when we talk about the University of Calgary IP policy and revenue distribution models, there's a couple important things to think about. First and foremost, the University of Calgary does have an IP policy that is available online. That being said, there have been a number of important developments over the years that have simplified the process of addressing revenue share agreements and equity sharing guidelines. I think it's important to understand that the university in general, and not just the University of Calgary, has been criticized for being challenging around equity and or royalty arrangements with startup companies. There are numerous considerations that need to be thought through when thinking about this. An important one is how simple is the process and whether or not the process of establishing equity sharing and or revenue distribution models creates what we would call multiple classes of shareholders. On the positive side, if you're using the Innovate Calgary University of Calgary Express Agreement approach, which is very simple and designed to address these considerations, it is generally considered to be one of the most investor-friendly approaches in the country. That being said, there are some subtleties, and your Technology Transfer Office and the University Research Services Office is the best place to discuss your options and alternatives. So conflict of interest is another policy at the University of Calgary where there's pretty clear guidelines which are available online. But one important element that comes up in this policy is that it is always best practice, and it's pretty straightforward to document time spent on startups or spin-outs in terms of dates and hours spent. This will help you manage any perceived or real conflicts of interest, but in general, it's important to chat with your division head or department head in order to disclose and or discuss potential conflicts within your department. So to wrap up, spinning a company out of the University of Calgary CSM is not a single event. It's a strategic transition. At its core, a spin-out means moving from an incubated, university-supported environment into a fully independent operation with its own people, capital infrastructure, and accountability. The right time to do that is not driven by enthusiasm alone, but by readiness. And readiness is defined by risk reduction, access to capital, and execution and capacity. You need a clear understanding of your technical and commercial milestones, how those milestones reduce risk from an investor's perspective, and what it will cost to achieve them. This includes protecting and maintaining intellectual property, managing cash runway, and accounting for the real cost of emerging from the university support in terms of equipment, space, grants, and services which will fall away. One of the most effective ways to be properly prepared and to think through to spin out or not to spin out is to develop a well thought out business plan that includes a realistic 24-month budget. Building this plan forces you to think through staffing, infrastructure, IP cost, regulatory requirements, overheads, and will allow you to do a direct comparison against the cost benefit of remaining within the university versus operating independently. In many cases, this exercise alone brings clarity to whether spinning out now truly makes sense. A critical part of readiness to spin out is early and ongoing engagement with potential investors and business advisors. Conversations with these people should begin well before a spin out occurs. These discussions help to validate whether or not your milestones are meaningful whether your funding expectations are realistic, and whether the business case resonates outside the academic environment. Investor and business feedback often shapes the roadmap and informs the timing of spin-out, and is even more critical if you're already in revenue, because business principles rather than technical principles will be weighted more heavily from a capital raising perspective. Technology readiness also matters. Tools like TRL help frame when a technology is mature enough to support a spin-out, but the right TRL varies by sector. Digital health, medical devices, therapeutics, and AI-enabled health technologies all reach spin-out readiness at different points. The goal is to spin out once we have de-risked the core technical milestones, but before regulatory and commercialization costs escalate beyond what the university environment can support. Equally important is having the right team and advisory support. While early milestones may be achievable by a scientific founder alone, raising larger rounds and building a sustainable company typically requires strong business expertise. Securing experienced business advisors, people who have raised capital, built companies, navigated commercialization, can significantly improve decision-making and, importantly, credibility with investors. Finally, successful spin-outs depend on good planning and clear governance, understanding IP ownership, equity structures, aligning with the University of Calgary policies, managing conflicts, and clearly separating university and company responsibilities. In short, the decision to spin out should be intentional, informed, and well-timed. With a strong business plan, a realistic 24-month budget, early investor engagement, experienced business advice, aligned milestones, spinning out becomes not just possible, but a solid foundation for building a sustainable and independent company.